Demon Slayer, it seems, is an unending source of delight, as it has returned my gaze not only to Aristotle, but also to one Soren Kierkegaard. I had forgotten what a pleasure it is to read the writings of this absurd Dane, but his own absurdity pales at my finding his Knight of Faith in a Japanese shonen anime. More absurdly still, I found not one knight, but two. But I get ahead of myself. In Deep Dive into Cruelty, I reference Tomioka as a Kierkegaardian Knight of Faith. In this video, I unpack that concept, focusing on both him and his teacher Urokodaki as they relate to Kierkegaard's explication of faith in his text Fear and Trembling. Published pseudonymously in 1843 under the name Johannes de Silentio, Fear and Trembling was Kierkegaard's response to the Hegelian principle that faith, qua faith, was a childlike principle that adults need to go beyond. Faith is a rather loaded term, especially for the Lutherans of Kierkegaard's day, and this is not the place to fully unpack it. To egregiously oversimplify the matter, by the time Kierkegaard rolls onto the scene, faith had moved from Luther's false dichotomy of faith and works, wherein simple belief was more important than action, into a false dichotomy of faith and reason. Hegel does not place faith in opposition to reason, but he does place it at the service of reason and, more importantly, the ethical life. As far as Kierkegaard is concerned, Hegel commits the error of perceiving faith as a stepping stone to being a decent citizen. For Kierkegaard, faith was an ongoing, continual process that leads not to being an ethical being, but to being someone who stands beyond the contemporary bounds of ethics. Kierkegaard performs his argument against the Hegelian principle by focusing on Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, since it was the incident which earned Abraham the title Father in Faith. After a brief introduction, the narrator gives examples of how the sacrifice of Isaac's story could have played out if it had been him in Abraham's shoes. Interspersed between the alternative stories are observations of mothers separating themselves from their infants. In each of Johannes's versions, Abraham does something that causes the tale to go awry, either with himself or with Isaac. The crux of the issue for these stories is the loss of the child of promise, which is, perhaps, why the weaning passages are also inserted. Parents must have faith that their offspring can become healthy adults without their perpetual hovering, after all. After these vignettes are complete, the Knights of Resignation and Faith are introduced. Each one of these knights is distinct from the common man, the vulgar bourgeois. Before ascertaining the appearance of the Knight of Faith, Johannes admires the Knight of Resignation. This knight is the man who realized the limits of his existence without any negative emotion. To fully express what this knight is like, we get a story of a man in love with a princess. The Knight of Resignation knows that his love for the princess can never be fulfilled, yet he retains his love for her without rancor or the hope of fulfillment. He needs none of this erotic titillation of the nerves at the sight of the loved one, etc., nor does he need in a finite sense to be continually making his farewell, for his memory of her is an eternal one, and he knows very well that those lovers who are so eager to see one another one more time to say farewell are right to be eager, right to think it will be the last time, for as soon as may be, they will have forgotten one another. He has grasped the deep secret that even in loving another, one should be sufficient unto oneself. He pays no further attention to what the princess does, and just this proves that he has made the movement infinitely. In both retaining the love while letting it go, the knight has produced an infinite movement not dependent upon necessity. It is not necessary that the Knight of Resignation give up his love for the princess. He could persist in it and pine forever, constantly racked with desire. In that case, there will always be agony. However, in infinite resignation there is peace and repose. Anyone who wants it, who has not debased himself by, what is still worse than being too proud, belittling himself, can discipline himself into making this movement, which in its pain reconciles one to existence. In infinite resignation there is peace and repose and consolation in the pain, that is, if the movement is made properly. The Knight of Resignation parallels the Stoic. His soul is filled with equanimity. We see the Knight of Resignation in both Tomioka and Urokodaki. When Tanjiro professes the familial bond he shares with Nezuko, Tomioka reflects on how others depending on such bonds have ended tragically. He has resigned himself to the knowledge that a demon, no matter how close the prior human was to his loved one, can never refrain from destroying humans. Flash forward to episode 17 when Shinobu comments on the possibility of friendship between demons and humans, and Tomioka responds that, as long as demons eat people, it's impossible. He has resigned the hope of friendship. Urokodaki is also first presented as a Knight of Resignation. Unlike Tomioka's more forthright resignation, however, Urokodaki's resignation is hidden. He trains Tanjiro as though he expects him to make it through the final selection, even when he believes Tanjiro's completion is impossible. The final act Tanjiro must perform for Urokodaki before attending final selection is to slice the largest boulder in the forest. When Tanjiro accomplishes the Herculean task, Urokodaki admits that he had not intended to permit Tanjiro to enter the final selection, yet he will keep his word. Before sending Tanjiro off, Urokodaki prepares a hot pot as Tanjiro cuts his own hair. It is an odd scene given Urokodaki's admission concerning his intention. The meal can be taken as a celebration overcoming an insurmountable task, or as the last meal of a condemned man. The meal is not positioned between an either-or, but rather a both-and. Tanjiro's achievement is worthy of a rich meal. Yet at the same time as we watch episode 3 end and continue through episodes 4 and 5, it becomes clear that Urokodaki himself had resigned the hope that any of his children would come back alive from final selection. It is clear from these moments that both Urokodaki and Tomioka have entered into infinite resignation, which is the last stage before faith, so that anyone who has not made this movement does not have faith. For only in infinite resignation does my eternal validity become transparent to me, and only then can there be talk of grasping existence on the strength of faith. So how do our slayers move from being knights of resignation to knights of faith? For Johannes, this movement rests in the absurd. But what is the absurd? The absurd is not one distinction among others embraced by understanding. It is not the same as the improbable, the unexpected, the unforeseen. The moment the knight resigned, he was convinced of the impossibility, humanly speaking. That was a conclusion of the understanding, and he had energy enough to think it. In an infinite sense, however, it was possible through renouncing it as a finite possibility. But then accepting that possibility is at the same time to have given it up. Yet for the understanding there is no absurdity in possessing it, for it is only in the finite world that understanding rules. And there it was and remains an impossibility. On this the Knight of Faith is just as clear. All that can save him is the absurd, and this he grasps by faith. The play of absurdity lies in the dynamic between finite and infinite possibility. It is at once and the same time admitting that something is both not possible yet possible at the same time. It is Schrödinger's cat. It is the improbable probability that you would even be born. It is the acknowledgement that something is utterly beyond one's grasp, but that it is also graspable. Without the belief in the possibility of the absurd, as laid out in Fear and Trembling, faith itself is not a thing, for it rests on the absurd as an a priori. And it is upon the absurd that Tomioka and Urokodaki ground themselves. Let's begin with Urokodaki and the example of ultimate faith in Fear and Trembling, the sacrifice of Isaac. I glossed over the preamble of the heart, wherein the narrator contrasts himself with Abraham, revealing how resignation is a substitute for faith. The absurdity of the sacrifice of Isaac is that Abraham has faith that he will retain his living son even through his obedient act of sacrifice. The narrator hones in on the absurdity and the manner in which resignation cannot substitute for faith when he admits that through resignation my behavior would have vitiated the whole story, for I would have been at a loss had I got Isaac back. What Abraham found the easiest of all would for me be hard, to find joy again in Isaac. When Tanjiro returns, battered and bruised from final selection, Urokodaki is dumbstruck. He had been resigned to the loss of Tanjiro. Nezuko kicks down the door and runs to Tanjiro, while Urokodaki, graciously transforming from a knight of resignation into a knight of faith, drops the firewood, runs to Tanjiro, and, crying, embraces him. This act wherein he embraces the siblings, coupled with his words of welcome, recreates the imagery of the Holy Family which had been lost in Episode 1, which would not have occurred if he had had difficulty with Tanjiro's return. Furthermore, his method of hypnotizing Nezuko and his construction of her box signifies his faith in their relationship and solidifies the foundation he has in the absurd. He never again appears as a knight of resignation. Meanwhile, Tomioka's demonstration of how he's a knight of faith is not as on the nose as Urokodaki's, but is more graceful. The faith Tomioka has is demonstrated by his fluidity of action whenever he encounters the siblings supporting each other. When Nezuko makes a defensive stance defending her brother, it startles Tomioka, but does not cause him to lose his composure, rather it redirects his actions. Instead of interpreting Nezuko's offensive rush as merely an attempt to kill and eat him, he reads it as a continuation of the protective spirit she revealed while guarding Tanjiro. Ergo, instead of treating Nezuko's protective stance as a fluke and using her headlong rush as an easy means of execution, he changes his stance to deal a submissive rather than mortal blow. He no longer sees a life or death situation, but instead treats the encounter as though it were training. His goal is to disarm rather than slay her. Even with as little as we know about demon slayers, Tomioka's actions seem unusual. After watching the entire season and meeting the Hashira, we realize that Tomioka's act of disarming Nezuko and then only providing a muzzle for her is downright absurd. Tomioka's own thoughts up to the moment he disarms her also stresses the absurdity of the situation. Starving demons will kill and eat their own parents and siblings. I've seen it countless times. Were he not a knight of faith, he would have acted like Tanjiro in episode 17 and granted Nezuko a swift, painless death. However, as a true knight of faith, Tomioka aids Tanjiro in his quest to reverse the demonic transformation. The impossible possibility has occurred once already, and Tomioka accepts it without hesitation. Nezuko has chosen to defend her brother rather than devour him. He then accepts that a bamboo muzzle will aid Nezuko in resisting the desire to eat people. He accepts that a hatchet-wielding charcoal craftsman can reach and receive aid from Urokodaki without Nezuko turning bloodthirsty and violent. He accepts these absurd presuppositions to the point of sending a letter to Urokodaki asking him to welcome the siblings. After all these things, he then puts the entire affair out of his mind. He does not dwell on it. He accepts the absurdity for what it is and continues on with his life as usual. He encounters the siblings again nearly 2 years later, having nearly completely forgotten them. Once more, Tomioka arrives on the scene in time to save Tanjiro from a demon attack, this one more dire than the last. Once more strangers, the two young men exchange arguments concerning the humanity of demons. As before, Tomioka is unmoved. That is, until he recognizes Nezuko. The moment he recognizes her, Tomioka's attitude changes from mild antagonism to protectiveness, as he adopts Nezuko's role from episode 1 in order to protect the prone siblings from Shinobu's attack. Finally, during the Hashira's meeting, we learn that both Tomioka and Urokodaki have such faith as to bet their lives on the absurd proposition that Nezuko will never harm humans. In such ways, we see how both Urokodaki and Tomioka manifest themselves as Kierkegaardian knights of faith, growing out of their earlier stations as knights of resignation. Having gotten as far as the Hashira's meeting, it would be remiss of me if I did not also take on the ethical Problemata Kierkegaard presented at the end of Fear and Trembling with regards to faith and Hegelian ethics. Just as these two characters manifest faith on par with Abraham's own, they also demonstrate how faith, and the grounds of faith, cannot be subsumed into a systematized moral framework. Problema 1. Is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? The axiom this problem addresses is that the ethical life is an end unto itself, and that the ethical life is universal. The goal of every man, in his particularity, is to submit himself to the universal, to always submit himself to the moral standards as lived out by the group. The goal of a particular person is always to live out the expression of universal ethics. Any time one seeks to assert his own particularity against the universal is in a state of immorality, as it goes against the ethical goal of the universe. Faith, however, is just this paradox, that the single individual is higher than the universal, though in such a way, be it noted, that the movement is repeated, that is, that having been in the universal, the single individual now sets himself apart as the particular above the universal. Let's focus on this strictly through Tomioka. The universal is represented by his fellow Hashira, those who hold that any demon is an evil that must be destroyed, and or those who righteously uphold the law of the core. Tomioka has placed the particular above the universal. The particular good and quest of the siblings was placed above the accepted norm of the Hashira. The faith Tomioka has in the pair's success is placed above the ethical universal of the demon slayer core. He has teleologically suspended the ethical. As the explanation stands, faith is just this paradox, that the single individual as the particular is higher than the universal, is justified before the latter, not as subordinate but superior, though in such a way, be it noted, that it is the single individual who, having been subordinate to the universal as the particular, now by the means of the universal becomes that individual who, as the particular, stands in an absolute relation to the absolute. Tomioka's placement within the Hashira ranks causes his act of sparing Nezuko to be a heinous crime. Knowing this, he nevertheless acted on his faith, thus separating himself away from the Hashira, the universal, and by making himself particular, wholly other, he now stands in direct relationship with the absolute, rather than the universal. In preserving Nezuko's life, Tomioka is putting his duty as a demon slayer in jeopardy, as well as the lives of the humans he is duty-bound to protect. He does not ask for forgiveness or explain himself to his fellows, nor is he tempted to undo his decision once it had been made. His resolve is firm. He has no proof that Nezuko will refrain from slaying humans. He acts on faith that she will. When he muzzled Nezuko and later aids Tanjiro during Nezuko's trial, he has no guarantee that Nezuko will not remove her muzzle or otherwise be undone by bloodlust. The only justification he has in his actions is the absurd fact that Nezuko proves his faith post factum. Problema 2. Is there an absolute duty to God? Here we return to a point referenced previously, that in his act of faith, Tomioka stands in absolute relationship to the absolute rather than the universal. It is at this point that the relationship between the ethical, the universal, and God comes to the fore. The starting point is in the relationship between the universal and the ethical, which we covered in the previous problema. Id est. The ethical as such is the universal, and as the universal it applies to everyone, which can be put from another point of view by saying that it applies at every moment. We saw the analogous relationship between the ethical and the universal by the manner in which the Hashira embody the duties and laws of the demon slayer core. The next stage is the relationship with God, the absolute. The argument goes, the ethical is the universal, and as such, in turn, the divine. It is therefore correct to say that all duty is ultimately duty to God. But if one cannot say more, one says, in effect, that really I have no duty to God. The duty becomes duty to God by being referred to God, but I do not enter into relation with God in the duty itself. If by doing the duty towards another I reference God by the act, I, in fact, only utter a tautology, insofar as God is understood as an altogether abstract sense as the divine, id est the universal, id est duty. The whole of human existence is in that case entirely self-enclosed, as a sphere, and the ethical is at once the limit and completion. God becomes an invisible vanishing point, an impotent thought, and his power is to be found only in the ethical, which fills all existence. Now we see the first half of the problem qua the query itself. In equating the ethical with the universal, and the universal as an omnipresent ethic, the divine itself is subsumed into, or equated with, the universal. For Kierkegaard this is a problem because it undermines the absolute nature of God. If God can be limited to the ethical alone, then God cannot be absolute, and therefore has no meaningful existence. God merely acts as a graver synonym for ethics. To continue with the analogy presented by the Hashira meeting, If the master does not hold a position separate from the ethics of the demon slayer core, the master becomes one with the Hashira and the codes or laws of the core. The master matters only inasmuch as he is a symbol of the core's ethics, but he in of himself matters not, as the sum of his existence is the ethics of the core. However, the master exists as an entity separate from, and even above, the Hashira, as well as the manner in which they embody the core's ethics. The goal of faith, so to speak, is to enter into a relationship with the Absolute without the mediation of the Universal, to enter into a direct relationship with the Master, not mediated by the Hashira. While it is a good and necessary thing to be shaped by the Universal, the submission of the self to the Universal fails to put the person into a relationship with the Absolute. In following the core's codes, the relationship to the Master is as to a figurehead, because the true relationship one has is with the duties performed and with those who mediated the duties, in this instance, the Hashira. The paradox at this juncture is that the single individual is higher than the universal, that the single individual determines his relationship to the universal through his relation to the absolute, not his relation to the absolute through his relation to the universal. In this example, the individual is Tomioka, the universal his fellow Hashira, and the absolute is the master. Tomioka's capacity and value as a member of the Hashira is established through his personal relationship to the master, not his ability to act as an appropriate member of the Hashira. As Mitsuri points out, there is no way the master could be ignorant of the situation. Like Odin's ravens, the master has his crows report to him of events concerning the world and core members. And with the additional revelation of Urokodaki's missive, we have an explicit example of the master's knowledge. Throughout the entire trial, in fact, Tomioka remains silent except for calling his fellow Hashira's attention to the master's coming. As a Hashira, Tomioka has broken the core rules. He has gone against the teaching and, furthermore, has kept his deeds hidden. He has given no explanation of his actions. Ethically speaking, Tomioka is in the wrong. Yet, since the master never rebukes him, it indicates that he has an appropriate relationship with the master. Concerning faith's relationship with the Absolute, Kierkegaard writes, "The paradox of faith has lost the intermediate term, id est the universal. On the one hand, it contains the expression of extreme egoism, doing this dreadful deed for his own sake, and on the other the expression of the most absolute devotion, doing it for God's sake. Faith itself cannot be mediated into the universal, for in that case it would be cancelled. Faith is this paradox, and the single individual is quite unable to make himself intelligible to anyone. It is important at this point not to be distracted by the fact that Tanjiro, and shortly Nezuko, are the ones on trial for their relationship. Tanjiro is not a knight of faith, and the role that he plays at this juncture serves a different purpose. The only reason why Tanjiro and Nezuko can be before the Hashira at all is due to Tomioka's act of faith in episode 1. Tomioka's mission as a Hashira is to destroy demons and save humans. In aiding the siblings he acts this out, albeit in a manner incomprehensible to his fellow Hashira, and Tomioka never seeks to explain his actions. This is due to the Hashira's inability to grasp what his actions signify. The Hashira cannot ethically mediate Tomioka's deed. I.e., they cannot understand or explain what he has done in regards to their own understanding of the standards of the core. This is why their focus is on Tanjiro, who is a member still subject to the universal and not independent of it, as one who as yet has no relationship with the absolute. They can attempt to mediate his manner of being in the world with their ethics. Tomioka remains aloof. He demonstrates that as for the Knight of Faith, he is assigned to himself alone. He has the pain of being unable to make himself intelligible to others, but feels no vain desire to show others the way. For him it is enough that he acted in accords with the Master, the Absolute. He rests on this knowledge and does not seek to explain or reveal it. But should any of us doubt that Tomioka was in relationship with the Master prior to Urokodaki's letter of explanation, the viewer need only consider the Master's well wishes for the demon Tameo. Tomioka serves the Absolute while he stands apart from his fellow Hashira, demonstrating that the single individual, as the particular, is higher than the universal, and as the particular stands in absolute relation to the Absolute. Problema 3. Was it ethically defensible of Abraham to conceal his purpose from Sarah, from Eleazar, and from Isaac? This final problem addresses the problem of silence. While Kierkegaard focuses on Abraham remaining mum concerning all involved in the sacrifice, we can focus on how Tomioka keeps his own counsel with regards to his fellow Hashira as well as the siblings. Tomioka never explains himself to Tanjiro, nor did he, or Urokodaki, warn Tanjiro of any consequences of his preserving his sister. His silence with regards to his fellow Hashira has already been somewhat explained in the previous Problema. Returning once more to the Hegelian principle and the ethical, we read, "The ethical is as such the universal. As the universal, it is in turn the disclosed. Seen as an immediate, no more than sensate and psychic being, the individual is concealed. So his ethical task is to unwrap himself from his concealment and become disclosed in the universal. Thus, whenever he wants to remain in concealment, he sins and is in a state of temptation, from which he can emerge only by disclosing himself. The Hegelian philosophy assumes there is no justified concealment, no justified incommensurability. The universal is what is known. It is what the consensus holds to be the good. The process of hiding anything, keeping something private, indicates that one either is doing, or has done, something wrong, or contemplates, or is at risk of, doing something wrong. Keeping one's own counsel is, in a Hegelian sense, unethical. For Tomioka to have acted ethically, as soon as he spared Nezuko, he should have informed his fellow Hashira about his deeds instead of remaining silent. In remaining silent, he put both Nezuko and Tanjiro's lives at risk as they both became targets of the Hashira. In remaining silent, Tomioka puts Tanjiro and other humans' lives at risk because if Tanjiro fails, it means Nezuko has slain humans. In remaining silent, and not slaying Nezuko, Tomioka risks Nezuko's humanity. Slain before she can kill another leaves some form of her humanity intact, and, as yet, sinless before the divine. In remaining silent, Tomioka put his fellow Hashira in danger of slaying allies, of them destroying their strongest hope of defeating Muzan. In keeping silent, Tomioka reveals the paradox, the divine and the demonic, for silence is both of these. It is the demon's lure, and the more silent one keeps, the more terrible the demon becomes, but silence is also divinity's communion with the individual. Consider the manner in which the demon, lower one, remains alone among the lower side. He speaks not, and thereby gorges on Muzan's blood. None of the demons can utter Muzan's name. Their silence gives them the opportunity to grow stronger, while speaking his name brings their destruction. But consider also the reverential silence granted to the master by the Hashira. Prior to his entrance, they were a huddled mass that spoke over one another and jostled for position. But when the master came, they all ordered themselves and were quiet, for each desired to hear his voice. And it is only after Tanjiro himself is silenced by Tokito that he is able to hear of the master's affection for Tomeo. This is the knife's edge Tomioka walks. In speaking, he acts ethically, which would in turn doom the siblings as well as the Demon Slayer core. In remaining silent, he echoes the demonic. Yet, in remaining silent, he carried on the will of his master and gave Nezuko and Tanjiro the opportunity for heroism. Tomioka remains silent, for there is no manner in which he can speak that will make him intelligible to his fellow Hashira, the universal, while at the same time fulfilling the act supporting the absurd belief that Nezuko can regain her humanity. Kierkegaard observes, "For if when I speak I cannot make myself understood, I do not speak even if I keep talking without stop day and night. The relief of speech is that it translates me into the universal." The Knight of Faith is silent and set apart with regards to the faith act. The faith act puts him outside the realm of the universal, beyond the intelligibility of his peers. He becomes one with the ineffable. But for all the supposed anguish of loneliness due to one locked in silence, he has a relationship, that with the Absolute. And his relationship with the Absolute is precisely what would be lost if the knight, if Tomioka, made himself intelligible to the universal, to his fellow Hashira. The faith Tomioka demonstrates is that demons are not beyond redemption, that they can either return to humanity, or, failing that, reside alongside humans as allies rather than predators. Tomioka, in remaining silent and pursuing the absurdity of an alliance with demons, demonstrates faith. which separates him from his fellow Hashira and makes him answerable only to the master, who in turn needs no explanation from him. In order for the Hashira to engage with Tomioka, they must each take their own separate, particular journeys of faith into an absurd trust in Nezuko. They must each abandon their distrust and animosity. As Tomioka, in particular, demonstrates the Kierkegaardian night of faith, he also demonstrates the fundamental critique Kierkegaard lays against Hegel, that the ethical is not the sum and culmination of human beings. The use of faith is not a means of molding ethical persons, but it is the means by which the particular transcends the ethical, alleviates the entirety of humanity in a manner which brings humankind closer to the absolute and further from the demonic. Tomioka's act of faith was the essential movement that prepares the universal, his fellow Hashira, to attain the goal that their ethics ironically prohibit, the destruction of Muzan. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this or found any of it thought-provoking, please feel free to hit like, share the video, drop a comment below, and take the conversation off the digital platform and into the physical world. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you feel so moved. Until next time, fare thee well.